Ocean Technology Incorporated, and in 1982, Deep Ocean Engineering Incorporated, to develop, manufacture, and operate equipment in the ocean and other remote or hostile environments. She has extensive field experience worldwide, including the leadership of more than 50 expeditions. She also holds a record for solo deep diving 3,000 feet. The author of more than 60 publications concerning marine science technology, Dr. Earle has participated in numerous television productions and delivered scientific, technical, and general interest lectures in more than 40 countries. She's a member of various professional societies and serves as a director on several foundations, boards, and committees relating to ocean research, ocean policy, and global conservation. Her honors and awards include the Explorers Club Lowell Thomas Award and the United States Department of the Interior's Conservation Service Award. She was named the Times Woman of the Year and the California Museum of Science and Industry's Woman Scientist of the Year. And in 1987, she was profiled in a film many of us have seen in the National Geographic Explorer series. Perhaps of most importance, just before I came to the podium this evening, Dr. Earle told me that she just recently learned she'd been nominated to be the chief scientist of NOAA, and next week she thinks she'll be up for the Senate confirmation hearings, and we wish her all good luck on that hearing. At the beginning of my introduction, I mentioned her royal deepness, a somewhat perhaps irreverent nickname apparently bestowed based on sources I've read by her academic colleagues. At the least, the title reflects a bit of awe at Sylvia Earle's accomplishments. I count it a great personal privilege to welcome Dr. Earle to this podium, and her topic this evening will be Exploring the Sea, a World of Adventure. Please welcome Dr. Sylvia Earle.
Thank you for that great introduction, and thank you for joining us under the tent. If you'd invited me here during the pre-Cambrian, we'd be sitting under an ocean right now. If we were, a few that I know there in the audience would be prepared, because you've learned the fine art of putting a face mask on and donning flippers and cruising around in that realm that once occupied Indiana. In fact, a distinguished citizen in these parts, Ed Ball, is one of those who is well known to the fish and has hundreds of hours in blue water cruising from the bottom side up. And I hope if you haven't already done so, that you don't let too many more days pass before you splash down and change your life forever. I'm going to mainly take you along this evening using a few images to sort of whet your appetite, if you'll pardon the expression. So if we could have the lights down and the slide projector on, I'll start with number one. Do I get to do that? Yes. You can imagine approaching the planet as aliens might, or to look at the planet the way a few lucky duck astronauts have had the chance to do, to stay up there in the sky and have that overview. It's very likely that if your job was to explore the planet, this planet, that you would not do what science fiction writers suggest you would do, which is to sidle up to human beings in some of our cities and ask to be taken to our leaders or whatever. Chances are, if you were really a smart alien, you would start with the oceans. You'd give priority, at least, to the oceans. It's perhaps understandable that as terrestrial residents of the place, we have a biased perspective that gets in the way of a true evaluation of what's really important about shaping global issues. But from afar, it's easy to see that land masses occupy only about a third of the surface. And measured from the standpoint of a fish, or the other critters out there, from the standpoint of three-dimensional living space, the ocean part of the biosphere is more than 2 orders of magnitude larger than the terrestrial part and contains more than 90% of life on Earth. the bulk of the plant's biosphere. Viewed historically, the oceans dominate again, with life in the sea preceding the appearance of terrestrial life by several 100 million years. If we could do as I suggested and nip back here, visiting Earth at a time, well, maybe not 500 million years ago when waves were splashing around where we sit, but let's say only half that time, about 250 million years from the present moment ago, the place, the continents, the Earth as a whole would look rather different. The Atlantic Ocean, for example, had not yet been formed at that point. That started into existence about 150 million years ago. The continents generally didn't look the way they do now, of course. They were all kind of squished together with a lot of the action taking place in the southern hemisphere. But if you were to take a walk along the beach at that point in time, chances are pretty good that you would recognize most of the creatures that you would encounter, or if you slipped on your face mask and flippers and took a look from that standpoint, you would find a fine assortment of crabs and clams and sponges and corals and anemones and urchins and starfish and seaweed. On the land, we would recognize ferns, a lot of insects, dinosaurs, turtles, crocodiles, but there would be some things missing because a lot has happened in the most recent 100 million years, let alone 250. Most mammals, for example, whales and primates, coincidentally made an appearance about 60 to 65 million years ago, at about the same time, give or take a few million years ago, that dinosaurs and many other creatures became extinct. To try to get my little mind around the magnitude of geologic time, and it really is tough. We're talking such a vast scale. I mean, starting 4.6 billion years ago. Geologist Don Eicher provides a useful model to me, and perhaps it will be to you. His little volume called Geologic Time is a source of a description where he tries to give a little perspective by suggesting that we compress all of the 4.6 billion years of Earth history into 1 year. He proposes that on that basis, the oldest rocks that we know about date from about mid-March. Living things appeared in the sea in May. Land plants and animals emerged in late November, and the richly vegetated swamps that formed the Pennsylvania coal deposits flourished for about 4 days in early December. Dinosaurs became dominant in mid-December, but disappeared at about Christmas time on the 26th. That was at about the same time that the Rocky Mountains first uplifted. Man-like creatures first appeared sometime during the evening of the 31st. And Columbus discovered America about 3 seconds before midnight. Viewed this way, not only humankind, but all land creatures are, relatively speaking, newcomers. Broad categories of plants and animals were thriving in the world's oceans long before insects evolved, before birds and mammals, ferns, flowers, trees, and other creatures that many people, maybe most of us, tend to think of as, quotes, life on Earth. It's certainly reflected in most biology texts. The emphasis is on the terrestrial, not on the oceans. And that reflects, in turn, one of our many biases. But again, if we imagine ourselves up there at that perch in the sky, looking down on this whole system as one single interacting ecosystem with the oceans dominant, it's well to keep in mind that we are newcomers, that the planet as we found it was the product of thousands of millions of years of history. Geologically speaking, we are obviously just inheriting a vast amount of diversity and systems that have grown over time before we arrived. And yet, in this brief time, these few seconds, geologically speaking, in this Eicher year, we are making changes that are of a geological magnitude. But to try to get a grasp of what some of these issues are, imagine that we are explorers, and we aren't equipped yet with some of the modern devices that now enable us to get into the sea. Imagine that you were starting about a century ago when the Challenger scientists set out for the first oceanographic expedition ever in the late 1800s. The equipment that they used included nets, dredges, and bottles that were lowered from the surface. That it was possible for them to get some information and draw conclusions about the sea is really quite remarkable when you consider what they're up against. Imagine, for example, that you're trying to discover something about Muncie using standard oceanographic techniques of 100 years ago, dragging a net through the streets, catching fortuitously whatever you could. Suppose it whipped through this campus in a swath maybe 40 feet across and picked up fortuitously in a jumbled up mass whatever it could catch. A few confused students and maybe an automobile or two. But all of this dumped on the deck of the oceanographic ship in the sky. I don't know about you, but looking at a jelly soup mix of this sort, trying to imagine what life is like in the depths below where it was obtained, is really a very difficult situation when, in fact, what you're trying to see are creatures with kind of delicate shapes, such as these lovely little jellyfish. I know for sure that living in San Francisco, and on a day-to-day basis, I have a hard enough time to figure out what's going on. And if you're trying to infer based on samples taken with nets and dredges and bottles, and even cameras lowered into the midst, it would be even more of a challenge. It isn't that we human beings haven't been longing to go into the depths and using our clever minds to come up with the ways and means of overcoming the lacks of nature to jump into the sea. This was not a remarkably successful approach, but it was ingenious. It was a system that was tried before Indiana became a state back in the 1600s. This device was actually reasonably successful despite its rather primitive appearance. It was tried in the 1700s. John Lethbridge was the crafty character who dreamed up the idea of going underwater in a barrel with a little window in it with his arms poking out. The trouble is the air inside ran out after a few minutes, got a little blue around the edges as carbon dioxide built up and oxygen began to be depleted. But it actually was successful for excursions into the depths of about 60 feet for about 20 minutes before he had to be hauled back up to the surface. But lucky you and lucky me, we do not have to look wistfully from the deck of a ship or peer longingly into the depths. We have come along in this last sort of millisecond of geologic time when techniques have been devised that even though we do not have built-in flippers, and even though we do not come like dolphins and whales with a convenient blowhole in the top of our head, we can use a snorkel or two, if you must, and actually get out there in the ocean where the action is. I know for sure that it's an easy thing to do. I think that I was lucky in that I came into the process of getting wet sort of gradually and under very pleasant circumstances. If I had to start on a rocky, rough, murky, cold coast of California, I'd find it a little bit more intimidating. Or if I had to take my first checkout dive as Ed Ball did in a quarry not far from here, I might not be quite as entranced with the idea of going underwater. But in fact, I fell in love with the ocean in the coast of New Jersey as a little kid, and my parents moved to Florida when I was 12, and my backyard was the Gulf of Mexico, where the water is clear and warm and blue, or at least it was at that point in history. It still is warm. It's not necessarily as clear or as blue as it once was, but it was irresistible, just as irresistible as the dune country in northern Indiana is to many of you. And it was just as natural as taking a walk in the woods to slip into the ocean, lured there by the fish and the crabs and the other critters. And if you haven't yourselves already been lured there, well, as I said in the beginning, don't wait too much longer, because you're denying yourself something really special. This individual is one of the very small number of people who have set records just breath hold diving. It's a bit of a challenge, and it makes me so jealous to see dolphins and whales take a big breath and then dive down, stay underwater for 20 minutes or half an hour or even an hour, and make excursions down to more than a mile in some cases beneath the surface. Some dolphins only to a few hundred feet. Some spend most of their time in the upper 100 or 200 foot level. But we human beings, in trying to press the limits, have succeeded, a few, in going to as much as 100 meters, a bit over 300 feet. And this gentleman, Jacques Mayol, about whom the film Big Blue was focused upon, set that record a few years ago. Just during the past year, it has been exceeded by a little bit, not much, by a young lady who also, just holding her breath, took a plunge and for more than 4 minutes held her breath. Not quite as good as dolphins and whales, but you try holding your breath for 4 minutes and see how far you get. I don't know about you, but I start to get a little blue around the edges, like John Lethbridge in his barrel, after about 45 seconds or so. It takes a good deal of practice and control to be able to do what Jacques Mayol has done. But with scuba tanks, it's easy. You're still kind of nibbling around the surface, considering that the average depth of the oceans is 14,000 feet, about the depth where the Titanic is resting in the North Atlantic. But here we are as divers, at least with a passport to go down to 100 feet, and if you really push the limits to 200 feet, on a passport that may last at 100 feet for 20 minutes, at 200 feet for 5 minutes before decompression is required. That's what these folks are doing, waiting for the gases that have accumulated in their bodies to escape. They have stayed a bit longer than no decompression limits allow. Suppose they have been to 200 feet for 20 minutes. The penalty for that is to decompress for about an hour hanging mid-water like this. Well, it isn't all bad. Hanging mid-water, you can watch the jellyfish cruise by, and you can become, if you practice a bit, very accomplished at the fine art of blowing air rings. This is the famous Al Giddings, who has done the film work for Abyss, The Deep, and some other Hollywood blockbusters. But he's also the world's record holder in blowing air rings, 43 on one breath. Well, there is an alternative to holding your breath and staying for long periods of time just by pressing your own individual limits using scuba and the like. And that is by staying underwater for long enough to become a saturation diver. Stay underwater in a little habitat, an underwater laboratory. The first experimental use of this took place in the early 1960s when Ed Link and Jacques Cousteau, concurrently with George Bond with the U.S. Navy, began pioneering the technique of staying underwater, breathing compressed gas of some sort, either compressed air or mixes of gases, and then just saving the decompression until the end of a period of time. It might be 24 hours, it might be a week, it might be a month, or in some cases 2 months. It's a technique that in the last 20 years has been developed and used primarily in the offshore oil and gas industry, so that presently there are divers who go and stay for weeks at a time, if not in the water, at least under pressure, at depths approaching 1,500 feet, and certainly on a more or less regular basis to 1,000 feet. But it's still a rather uncommon technique for most people, and certainly for scientists. But a few have had access, and I'm one of those lucky ones who have had access to underwater habitats, and I've used several on dives that have lasted as much as 2 weeks, including the first one that I made in 1970 in this habitat, the tektite habitat. It's a beautiful system. It was provided with a companion piece that is unlike scuba tanks in that instead of releasing air into the water column, rebreathers were used. These recycle air over and over, and it makes it really nice if you want to be sneaking on a reef and tiptoe up to the fish without alarming them, because no picturesque cloud of bubbles is formed. You just rebreathe the same air over and over again, removing carbon dioxide chemically and adding oxygen as required. It's exactly the same principle that is used in submarines, but on a very small scale. You become, in effect, a little submarine yourself and change the buoyancy to suit your purposes. This is the entrance to the habitat. It's the front door, the back door, the only door. There was a window, a porthole in the structure that had a little sign over it that was placed by one of the former occupants when I got into the habitat with my fellow aquanauts. It said, "In case of fire, break glass." It's really lovely staying underwater, because in so doing, you get to know the fish on a one-to-one basis. It's not random fish, but that fish that lives under that rock. It's the first time I realized that some fish actually turn over on their sides to sleep. Just don't think of fish doing things like that, but many of them do. They go back in a crevice or a cave, and some, like the parrotfish, actually spin something like a sleeping bag in which to curl up at night. You'll find, if you spend much time underwater, that fish really do have character and personality, but more of that in a moment. First, let me introduce you to another little underwater habitat. This is called the Hydro Lab. It's a small system that accommodated 4 people. It was located off the east coast of Florida, then moved to the Bahamas, and finally spent several years bubbling away in the U.S. Virgin Islands. Hundreds of scientists and others had an opportunity to find out what it's like to live on a reef and become a part of the action from the inside out. It's a bit like going camping in the woods. Instead of driving through or flying over it in an airplane, which is more like what we do with the ocean. We scoot across the surface in our boats, looking over the side, but rather, this is like going out there and camping, staying there, being a part of the action for a while, and getting to know the critters on their own terms. Well, here's the entrance to that little habitat. The fish used to come and gather around the door. They learned pretty quickly that there were handouts to be had from time to time. We could use that little swimming pool that we could peer out and see little eyes looking back at us. Big barracuda set up housekeeping to catch the little fish that were attracted to the lights and to our handouts. We, in fact, during one extraordinary series of dives, had the opportunity to use this underwater taxi cab. It's the submersible called the Johnson Sea Link. There are 2 of them. They're distinctive because they have a clear sphere in the front where 2 people can sit and fly around in the ocean looking out to see, almost full spherical view, like being in a bubble. In fact, it is a bubble. And 2 people can curl up in the diving compartment in the back part of the submarine. And that aft section can be pressurized so that a door opens, allowing people to swim in and out. We swam out of the underwater habitat, the hydrolab, and into the submarine, closed the hatch, and were taken over to the edge of a drop-off. Here you see an artist's concept of what it looks like, with a little habitat, the drop-off, and the submarine that took us out to the edge and let us swim out at a depth of 250 feet. Now, to a diver, 250 feet is very deep, especially when you're breathing just compressed air, which we were. But when you think about it, 250 feet is way up here when you're looking at an ocean that has a maximum depth of 7 miles, 35,000 feet, plus an average depth of 14,000 feet. So even though by diver standards we were doing some interesting deep diving, the reality is we're still just skimming along on the surface. All of these techniques really are a means to an end. They're delightful ends in themselves, like flying is wonderful to do, but airplanes take you someplace in the end. And that's with diving and with habitats and submarines. The goal as well, you actually get to go places and get to do things that you otherwise cannot see or touch or become acquainted with. Looking at things of this sort, the diversity of life on a coral reef, is one of the reasons why it's important to stay underwater, to have greater time at greater depths, to get to know fish on their own terms. One thing that quickly becomes apparent in salt water anywhere is the magnificent diversity of life. If basic, broad categories of life, the phyla, the classes, the orders and such, are given somewhat greater weight than the splintery ends of diversity recognized as species, the greatest diversity of life unquestionably is in the sea. We hear a great deal these days about the high diversity in rainforests, and you should believe it because it's true, especially on a species level and especially with insects. But look at the ocean and the categories of life that are unique to a saltwater environment. Nearly every division of plants and animals has at least some representation in the sea, and many are principally or wholly marine, but in contrast, only about half of the major divisions are represented on land. At least some representatives of most of the divisions of life that have ever occupied space on Earth are still out there in the ocean. The history of life written in the lives of the creatures that are still cruising around in the oceans, although in some cases we have available just a few kinds that are precariously vulnerable to what we do or don't do. I don't know how many of you who have grown up and spent maybe much of your time in the Middle West, have had a chance to see a live nautilus or, let's say, a live horseshoe crab. Both are creatures that represent the last remnants of a kind of critter that was once very abundant. If we lose the 4 species of these crabs, they aren't really crabs, they're big arachnids, believed to be the ancestors of spider kind, the horseshoe crabs, so-called because they resemble crabs. They live a precarious existence because at this point in time, they reproduce in the world's most polluted waters, in places such as Chesapeake Bay, which is not totally polluted, but where those crabs deposit their eggs, they are really vulnerable. Along the edges of other continents in the inshore coastal waters, where we have modified things dramatically just in the past few years, that split second of geologic time, in spite of the fact that nautiluses and horseshoe crabs have persisted miraculously through hundreds of millions of years, reasonably unchanged, but still carrying this precious genetic cargo that is distinctly different from anything that we're going to find in any other critters, they may not survive the century. To fully appreciate the diversity and abundance of life in the sea, it helps to think small. It helps to think microscopic. If you do, and look at the ocean that way, it really does become dazzling. Every spoonful of ocean water contains life, from the surface down to the greatest depths. On the order, well, the number of bacteria alone is reasonably staggering, but add to it the assorted plants and animals in the larval forms that occur in the plankton, ranging from larval sponges and corals to starfish and clams in the tiny microscopic stages of their life. In effect, the entire liquid mantle that embraces the planet is a living minestrone, with most of the bits small or microscopic. Well, there's some exceptions like whales and things, but most of the action is minuscule. As an example of this broad-scale diversity and also thinking small, consider this bleak-looking rock. It's only about 18 inches across. We brought it up carefully from a depth of about 600 feet beneath the surface, from along a steep drop-off in the Bahamas. We captured it using the manipulator on a submarine. At first glance, you'd think, well, that looks as though it might have come from the moon. And if it had, there would be, of course, no life associated with it at all. But upon close inspection, that thing that looks like a tar blob in the middle is really a relative of a starfish, a crinoid, one that is not like other crinoids. Most of them are sea lilies. They look like a flower on a stalk, but this one is sort of glommed on, pressed flat onto the rock. And it took some doing and some puzzling to figure out just what it was, but it was one big phylum that was represented by that particular beast. In addition, there were sponges, coral, nematodes, lamp shells, brachiopods that is, and little encrusting bryozoans, a tiny snail, several amphipods, tiny worms of various sorts. In all, 11 different phyla of animals were represented in 3 divisions of plants. So in a microcosm, this bleak-looking rock contained much of the history of the life on the planet, reflected in the genetic codes of creatures that were more than just a little bit different from one another. Such large-scale diversity cannot be found in any non-marine area of comparable size, or even quadruple the size, or even make it the size of this area occupied by this tent. It would be hard on land to find 11 phyla represented in that space. The diversity in the ocean on that scale is just magnificent. You'll see it so easily when you put your face in the water, in salt water, as compared to fresh water, or even a walk in the woods. All these little critters that, unless you put your face in the water and get to know them, how would you know? Maybe you don't care that some hermit crabs have blue eyes, but it's fascinating to find not only that some of these little beasts do have unexpected characteristics, but that they are curious about you, even things that are, you would think, too small to take any notice of something as loomingly large as we. This is a little creature that some of you will recognize as an arrow crab, 3 or 4 inches across, but they certainly do know when you're approaching because they usually scurry for cover. In that blue realm of the ocean, most of the action is not where we are up near the surface, and it's not even where we direct much of our attention because we're surface-oriented people and territory or land-oriented people or organisms. We think of the bottom of the ocean as the other target, but actually most life in the ocean is in that 3-dimensional realm from the surface down to the bottom. I mean, that's what the ocean is. It's not the top, it's not the bottom, it's that space. It's where the water is. It's where the action is. It's where creatures that would cause Luke Skywalker to eat his heart out if he had a chance to get out there and see them. I mean, Steven Spielberg, if he wants inspiration, should go cruise around in the ocean, and maybe, in fact, he did. I don't know how many of you saw The Abyss, but those gorgeous, luminous, mythological Hollywood-type creatures that were conjured up to encounter the heroes of the film, they just weren't a patch on the real thing that you encounter every time you go into the sea. Turn out the lights and watch the bioluminescence. It's something that will, again, change your thinking forever. It's like fireflies times a zillion, especially in the deep sea, where some 90% of the creatures that live there have at least some form of bioluminescence, either luminescence that they create themselves or capture in the form of bacteria that they cultivate in little patches like some fish do and other creatures, or some of the jellyfish that flash blue, or the octopuses and squids in the deep sea that instead of releasing black ink, what good would that do in a black sea where it's dark all the time? They release bioluminescent ink to distract and confuse their would-be pursuers. Well, and yes, then there are the fish. Someday, I would like to come back and tell you or talk to you just about fish stories, some real fish stories, no exaggerations. Just tell you about what it's like to get to know fish in a way that transcends fish on a plate with lemon slices and butter. People ask me if I eat fish, and certainly I've been known to munch on a few in my day, but I don't eat anybody that I know personally. Actually, when you get to know them, it's like considering anything else. We have come through time to concentrate our munching on birds to things like turkeys and chickens and a few exotics such as Cornish rock hens. We know that bluebirds are edible, but we choose not to eat them. Maybe in due course we'll concentrate more on raising things such as catfish and trout and others, and less we'll concentrate on the wild-caught creatures, especially those that you get to know personally. This is one of the little parrotfish that has a habit of spinning its own little sleeping bag. One of the plant eaters. There are lots of them in coral reef situations. Flounders are among those that are not plant eaters by and large. They tend to be like most fish. They're carnivores. They have this wonderful habit of sitting at the top of a food chain. They are mostly carnivorous. Looking at the fish, you sometimes think that you're out there watching them until you find to your great amusement and sometimes very disconcerting that they are the watchers as well. It's hard to figure out who's the watcher and who's the watchee. Just a few weeks ago, I had a chance to go to the Tokyo fish market, and having been inspired by seeing many fish look back at me, it was a little disconcerting to see these boxes of fish on their way to market. This actually was the great fish market. You have to go early in the morning, about 4 a.m. By 6 a.m., most of the action is over. They process hundreds of tons of fish that are brought from all over the world, including from exotic places, deep sea fish such as these, with their great luminous eyes. I couldn't help but think, while walking past and imagining all the fish that I've watched and have watched me, the exquisite structure of these deep sea fish eyes that are designed to capture minute amounts of light in the deep sea. And with all of our engineering skill and all of our biological skill, all of the science and all of the physics and so on, that we still don't know how to make an eye like that. Maybe we'll appreciate, for reasons other than just something to put on our plate, these incredible creatures with their unusual forms in due course. Creatures such as the tuna fish, which were coming into the market in great abundance during my visit just a few weeks ago, but it wasn't just that morning in a unique sort of way. It's every morning, every day. These large quantities of wild-caught creatures captured in gill nets, captured in long lines, captured in trawls, captured in every way that you can imagine. They're sweeping the seas of the world into not just the Tokyo fish market, but markets around the world. It's a wonder, you sometimes think when you see this kind of abundance, that there's anything left in the oceans at all. It is such a vast quantity. And having seen tuna fish on their own terms, eye to eye, and here are some of the wonderful Pacific yellowfin tuna, the sort that are living sometimes in association with the dolphins, and in the process of taking the tuna, dolphins are sometimes taken as well. But although we are at last beginning to be concerned about what they call the bycatch, the rather wasteful process of killing dolphins in the process of getting tuna fish, concerned about the livelihood, the fate, the future of tuna themselves, considering that the Atlantic bluefin tuna has declined precipitously in the last few years, the last 20 years, because it looks as though we have taken too many. It may be the case with the yellowfin and others as well. And it's not surprising when you consider that these are high-speed, top-of-the-line predators that when you munch on a tuna fish sandwich that has occupied perhaps a pound of fish to put together your salad or casserole, At the bottom of the food chain that it took to make that pound of tuna fish is something like 50,000 pounds of plant material. No farmer would think that that was a very efficient way to go. It takes about 2 pounds of food to get a catfish under cultivated circumstances, maybe 2 or 3 pounds for a chicken, perhaps 20 pounds for beef, 50,000 pounds through the food chain to get a 10-year-old or so tuna fish that winds up on your plate. Am I advocating that you shouldn't eat tuna fish? Well, there may be a little hint of that somewhere around the edges, but in fact, I think that we should continue to find the ways and means to take with great care from the wild populations in the sea. But particularly when we eat something like tuna, we should do so with great respect, whether it's sushi or whatever it is. Some people have the notion that fish in the sea are free, and in some respects, given the way we've looked at wild wilderness resources in the past, that's still the basis of much of our economic calculations. But if we put aside the source and just imagine what the costs are beyond that, things that we really can get our minds around. For example, what's it take to get a fish to market? And once you've gotten the fish to market, what do you do with the boxes that you took there? Well, this is what happens to the Tokyo fish market boxes. They stack up in big piles every day in heaps like this. And that too has become a cost. The cost that is now being calculated by organizations such as the Center for Marine Conservation that has set up kind of an annual patrol of beaches around this country at least to see what happens when things like this are tossed back into the ocean after they have ceased to be useful for the original purpose. In a 3-hour stretch last year, for example, volunteers organized by the Center for Marine Conservation found more than 30,000 plastic bags in a 3-hour sweep of a Texas beach, more than 30,000 plastic or styrofoam cups, some 2,000 disposable diapers, and on down the list of cigarette butts and so on and so on. There is a cost if that is to not only be cleaned up, but it's a cost in terms of what it does to the environment in which it then becomes maybe not a permanent part, but certainly a durable part, given that plastic bags last about 50 years out in the ocean, and that a styrofoam cup on the order, so I'm told, of about 500 years. And that sort of can be put into perspective. If you can imagine Christopher Columbus tossing a styrofoam cup over the side on his way to America, that when we celebrate 500 years next year, 2 years from now, that little cup might still be drifting around or welcome us when we go down to celebrate. That's the pile of boxes. In Prince William Sound, the cost was not limited to cleaning up the rocks, although that cost amounted to something on the order of $2 billion. The cost was not what it took to scrub the otters, or even in terms of accounting the lost lives of the otters and birds and barnacles and other things, but rather it leaves a big question about cost. How do you put a damaged system back together again? Take, for example, this marsh in Florida that was turned into a conduit for cooling water for a nuclear power plant some years ago. Surely the engineers involved didn't think of anything in terms of cost other than what it took to get the machinery out there to dig the hole. However, last week in the Washington Post, a little analogy was made about just the marsh itself. In this case, an example was used for Louisiana marsh that was selling on the market for on the order of $500 an acre. But if you account what that marsh gives back to humankind that we don't really usually put on the balance sheet, like Prince William Sound, gives us a great deal that we think of as free. Things such as sewage treatment, a nursery area for some of the critters that we like to go out and catch that are commercially important, the oxygen that gets poured into the atmosphere, the CO2 that's absorbed. the recreational value, the habitat for birds. The accounting that the steely-eyed economists finally came up with for the Louisiana marsh was not $500 an acre, but more on the order of $17,000 an acre. I love working with engineers as a biologist because it's fun to challenge them. I know I can always win by saying, can you make a critter once like this big grouper? Can you put it back together again? Could you build me one of those, please? And it isn't just, could you build one that has a shape like that with fins that move, a place where eyes could be, but rather something that really does what a live creature does. And I don't care whether we're looking at a lovely giant grouper or whether we're talking about a flea or a fly or an ant or a grasshopper. The answer is always the same, that we take so much for granted in terms of this inheritance that we live with, these live creatures that surround us, that we, if we destroy them, have no way of learning how to put it back together again. We are beginning, at least underwater, to respect the differences among fish, to understand their value to us for more than something to munch on. And just as we began to recognize the value of birds for more than a meal, we are beginning to look at fish for the characteristics that they have. In fact, the character that they have. Some are shy, some are aggressive, but most of them have personality that you get to know when you spend time in their own turf. Like their counterparts on land, the ocean ecosystems provide us with a wealth that we take for granted. You know the story for sure, the golden goose that produces lots of golden eggs if you take care of the goose. Or in this case, we can make an analogy perhaps about the golden grouper, that if we take care of the oceans, that we will have an ongoing wonderful supply of sustainable resources and a healthy planet. Let's climb back up into the sky for a few moments and think hard about the special opportunities that we still have to make choices that are available to us that will enable us to live compatibly on the planet with fish and turtles and nautiluses, to live within our environmental means. There is no question that we are now tearing through our environmental bank account, if you will, at a rate that inevitably will do us in. Life surely will go on. I mean, it preceded us by a lot of time before we ever got here. The question is, can we manage ourselves so that we can live compatibly with the creatures that are here on the planet with us? The giant first step is in getting to know the planet and to figure out how we can attain that elusive goal of harmony or sustainability, what we used to call once upon a time the balance of nature. It's a euphemism, I suppose, for finding this way to live within our environmental means. An environmental architect, I guess that's what you call him, Ian Maharg, tells a story in his book, Designed with Nature, about two little squishy pieces of life, blue-green algae, I suppose, that survived the atomic holocaust, and they were down in the little crack in a rock, the last living things on the planet after this ultimate boom took place. One little piece of blue-green jelly looked at the other little piece of blue-green smudge and shook its head and said, "Next time, no brains." Actually, I think we need all the brains we can muster, all the good heads we can get together to think about what we can do to harness our technology, our philosophy, our music, or whatever it takes to think about the common ground, the uncommon ground that we share with all the creatures who are on the planet with us. Such thoughts were not in the minds, I think, of William Beebe and Otis Barton when they harnessed the most modern technology of their day in the 1930s to, for the first time, catch a glimpse of what life was like in the deep sea, half a mile beneath the surface. Otis Barton was the engineer, William Beebe, the scientist, the zoologist, who conspired to build this bathysphere was a remarkable device. Imagine cramming your fragile body into a steel ball that was suspended precariously from the end of a wire and lowered over the side on the deck of a rolling boat in the Atlantic Ocean. Nobody had done such a thing before. But their rewards were magnificent. They got to see bioluminescent creatures on their own terms for the first time, and not just see blobs of jelly brought back in a net. At about the same time, in the early 1930s, in England, this device was being launched into the sea for the first time. Even then, this early version of what is now known as the Jim looked something like the Michelin Man. Jointed appendages, the human being inside. The human being that is in this photograph is Jim Jarrett, the first person willing to put it on. Thus they named it after him. I think well that they should. The inspiration behind the design of this system was to find a way to go down to more than just a few feet under the surface. In fact, to go down to where the Lusitania had sunk in 400 feet of water. The designer of the system, Joseph Perez, had never done anything in terms of underwater designing before, but he really wanted to get out there to the Lusitania, and so put his clever mind to work and came up with this system, a hard suit, so-called, with oil-filled seals. Oil is incompressible, and so by having joints that had oil around O-ring rubber barrier seals, it made it possible for the first time to overcome the problems of going deep, keeping 1 atmosphere, the same pressure that we have sitting here on the lawn, underwater at 400 feet because of the protective suit. I had a chance some years later, actually in 1979, to use a modern, updated version of the Jim. The concept actually didn't get used very much between the 1930s and the 1970s because nobody thought it was too important to go deep in the ocean. It just, they used submarines, they got into other deep diving techniques, but avoided the use of so-called atmospheric diving suits that in many ways are comparable to what astronauts use when they walk around on the moon. In both cases, you're protecting yourself from a hostile environment. Astronauts have to protect themselves from the lack of pressure in a vacuum, basically, the vacuum of space, or the low atmosphere of the moon. In the deep sea, it's quite the other way around. You've got a little too much pressure for our human bodies to endure comfortably. So if you forget about subjecting yourself to pressure and instead wrap yourself in a protective container and instead become like a little submarine, a personal submersible, a submarine that you can wear, if you will. In the Jim, you are the propulsive power, though. There aren't any thrusters, no motors. It's what the engineers call the KISS principle. I'm sure you engineers have heard of it. K-I-S-S. Keep it simple, stupid. So your arms move, those jointed arms, and your legs and your metal trousers make it possible to walk along on the sea floor. Astronauts on the moon have similar kind of life support, a rebreather package on their back. The difference, of course, is that there are more footprints on the moon, even now in 1990, than there are as much as a mile beneath the surface of the ocean. There is one very big difference between going up to the surface of the moon and going to the, I only went 1,250 feet beneath the surface of the ocean. But wherever in the ocean you go, it's the same. It's not the same creatures, but the same in that there is life everywhere. During the dive that I made in Hawaii, 6 miles offshore, 1,250 feet down, I found wonderful creatures at every turn. These big spider crabs, for example. And if you look very closely, you can see that clutched in the back legs of this little crab, big crab actually, it's about 1 foot across, it's got 2 little bouquets of coral. Why is he walking around on the seafloor with coral in his hind legs? I don't know. But that he is doing it, we now do know. And if we'd captured him in a net, we probably wouldn't have seen this phenomenon, this characteristic of crabdom. I saw corals that looked like big bed springs that were growing on the seafloor, taller than I am. Some of them were well over 6 feet tall. when I touched them, they flashed with blue fire, just rings of blue light spiraled all the way down from the top to the bottom. And again, if those had been captured in a net, that blue fire characteristic would quickly die. Being there makes a big difference. You actually get to see in their own territory what's going on. Certainly, now there's a chance for some people to get into the act. A lot of little gym suits have been built. They're available for those who want to stomp around on the seafloor, but mostly they've been used in support of the oil and gas industry. And there are other techniques that have been developed that make it somewhat easier to explore. One of the most famous is the Alvin, a little submarine that you must have heard about one way or another. It's the submarine that Bob Ballard used in terms of exploring the Titanic, and from the Alvin, the little Jason Jr. robot flew and went into the Titanic and brought back those wonderful images of what is going on 14,000 feet beneath the surface. Using the Alvin submersible over the last 2.5 decades, it just celebrated its 25th birthday this past year. Some magnificent discoveries have been made, sometimes in combination with other equipment, towed arrays, camera systems, but just the Alvin itself with hundreds of dives, enabling scientists to visit places that otherwise would be off limits to them, to us. Finding these peculiar hot vents in the deep sea floor is a phenomenon that certainly was not known to Challenger scientists a century ago. It was only in the late 1970s that the first one was discovered, along with whole communities of animals that previously were not known. These gigantic tube worms, again, 6 feet or so high, whole new categories of life that until we got down to where the action was 2 miles beneath the surface, we did not know that such things existed. Consider the difficulties of going to the deepest part of the ocean, 7 miles down. Consider this, that it's only happened once in the history of humankind. Well, it's only happened once round trip. It's easy to go one way. This is the device called a Trieste that was used in 1960 by U.S. Navy Lieutenant Don Walsh and a Swiss engineer Jacques Picard, who curled their bodies up inside the ball that is at the bottom of the large black sausage-like structure, which is filled with gasoline. It's actually an underwater balloon. Gasoline is lighter than water. And without weights, the whole big structure floats. So they used weights to sink the system, to just go down by being heavy, like a balloon in reverse. And once they got to the bottom and looked around for 20 minutes, observed, among other things, looking at their tiny little porthole eyes looking back at them, a flounder-like fish enduring 16,000 pounds of square inch on its little body, as was the machine itself enduring that much pressure. After 20 minutes, they dropped weights and came back to the surface. And the two individuals are conspiring with some of the rest of us now to solve the problems in a more meaningful way about how do we go to the deepest part of the ocean. It is, after all, only 7 miles. 7 miles in any other direction is, let's go to the grocery store, or let's zoom over to the ballpark or whatever. But 7 miles down happens to be, right now, a pretty big deal. There are only 5 submarines in the whole world, in fact, that can go half the distance. There is no submarine owned by any country, by any individual, none in existence that can make the round trip at this point. The Trieste was retired about 5 years ago, having made that descent only once. But the deep sea is there. There are trenches in various parts of the world, some of them nearly as deep as the trench that the Trieste explored so briefly back in 1960. Willard Bascom describes in great detail in his book, The Crest of a Wave, recently published, about his experiences trying to sample the Tonga Trench, which is short of being the deepest trench in the world by about 200 feet. He had available to him for sampling a tube It was about 6 feet long, about 3 or 4 inches across, weighted at one end, and was dropped into the trench, all the way down, almost 7 miles. Based on a little chunk of basalt that he was able to capture using this clever technique, he had to extrapolate as a geologist and kind of figure out what was going on in this structure that is more than 200 miles long and more than 40 miles wide and 7 miles deep. And he's got this little chip of rock. Talk about being a good detective. You better be a good detective if you want to be an ocean biologist or an ocean geologist, considering the evidence that you have to go on. Why bother? Why do these mad things? Why get out there into the deep sea? Well, I don't know about you, but I find it irresistible. It's partly because we're human beings. If we know there's something there that we don't know, curiosity is going to just push us into finding out if we possibly can. But more and more, there is this underlying compelling need to find out how the planet works from the inside out as well as from above, looking down. Knowing this a few years ago, Don Walsh, Jacques Picard, and engineer Graham Hawkes, and I, and a handful of others, and the number is growing, I'll tell you, really decided that we wanted to overcome the problems. And we came up with the first step toward a solution about how to inexpensively and effectively make the descent to the deepest part of the ocean. And the first step was a little system called Deep Rover. As a biologist, I'd like to be able to see out of my submarine, thank you very much. The Navy doesn't care so much about such things. They build submarines with no windows, you might have noticed. But to be able to go down and explore the ocean, it certainly does help to be able to see out, and so a clear sphere makes a lot of sense. And so does the fact that glass, that wonderful material, glass, has the promise of being one of the best materials for deep diving submarines, because under pressure it just gets stronger. In fact, some of the best instruments for the ocean are glass spheres that, as they go deeper, become much stronger and can withstand great pressure. They're most vulnerable on the deck of the ship. So far, we do not yet have materials in a glass-like form, clear ceramics that are available to build the submarine of our dreams, although the potential is surely there. But as an alternative, as a first step, we chose acrylic, a clear plastic, for the 3,000-foot rated submarine Deep Rover, and set about to build it with funding from Canada, with a Canadian company that was able to justify it because of anticipated work in the offshore oil and gas industry. So in 1984, Deep Rover was launched. And I'll tell you, one of the great things about Deep Rover is that you can...
Well, Sylvia, welcome. And what I'd love to hear you talk about a little bit is what are the driving forces that sort of compel you to get involved with this work of underwater life? Is it a sort of intellectual exercise, or is it something spiritual? What's it all about?
The lure for me to get into the ocean and to become a marine scientist, and more recently to become involved with marine technology and engineering, has been to not be able to resist getting out to where the action is as far as life on the planet is concerned. Most people think of living creatures in terms of what they have in their everyday point of reference. And yet, if you pull back and look at the planet in the way that an astronaut might from a distance, or if you were an explorer coming to the planet for the first time, charged with the idea of looking for life on Earth, chances are good that if you were smart, you'd approach the oceans, because that's where most of life on Earth really is. About 90% of the biomass is in the sea. And in terms of the big, broad divisions of plants and animals, again, the greatest diversity on the planet is in the sea. I didn't really appreciate these big things when I was a child, but I did fall in love with the ocean. First exploring the beaches along the New Jersey shore, and then as a child of about 12 when my parents moved the family to Florida, and my backyard was the Gulf of Mexico. And the way to explore what the critters were doing was to get out where the critters are, and that meant getting into the water. And my first experiences were just, getting in the water, period. But the part that I found to be the greatest asset was just a face mask, because then I could see underwater. If I had only one piece of equipment, if I could only choose one piece, that would be a face mask, that it would make it possible to clearly view the fish and the crabs and the plants and all of the other action. All the other things that I've had the fun of using over the years have been enhancements, starting with flippers and a snorkel, and then moving on to scuba tanks, and then underwater habitats that prolong depth and time underwater. I've had the fun of staying for as much as 2 weeks underwater, using a little underwater laboratory as a base of operations, but swimming out from it a distance of 1/4 of a mile or so in an area in the U.S. Virgin Islands, and later in the Bahamas, and in the Virgin Islands to elsewhere in the Virgin Islands, using another underwater habitat, and in the Florida Keys. So on 6 occasions I've had the fun of being an underwater resident, using equipment that goes beyond scuba, a system called a rebreather that recycles air over and over, and similar in some ways to what astronauts use when they walk on the moon. They don't take a breath and then expel the air into the atmosphere, or lack of it, in space or on the moon. They protect that precious source of life and have it in a recycling package that scrubs out carbon dioxide chemically and adds oxygen as required. And the same thing was true with the rebreather systems that I have had the opportunity to use in connection with underwater laboratories.
Mm-hmm. So the lure was a need to find out some of the secrets of the universe as a whole, and almost, which is a big job. And then the technology helped you get down there to do that. Now, what are some of the secrets that you're finding as you go about your work? Have you had an occasion to just have a big discovery that's just been thrilling?
Well, technology is a means to an end in terms of ocean exploration. We are as earthbound as elephants who wish to fly in terms of going into the sea. Just as if we want to go up into the air, it's necessary to adapt ourselves through technology, through engineering, to have various aircraft. We've longed for so long to be able to do what birds do and get up into the sky. And now we've overcome many of those problems and gone even beyond our own atmosphere. And in the ocean it's the same way. But for me, although going there in submarines and habitats and so on, just diving, is a wonderful, pleasurable end in itself, for me it's a means to an end. It's a way to get to where I want to go. And where I really want to go is anywhere in the ocean that is there. Right now we're limited, curiously, to a very small portion. When you bear in mind that the ocean is, after all, 14,000 feet average depth, maximum 7 miles. There are submarines now, only 5 of them, that can go to 6,000 meters, about 18,000 feet, about half the depth of the ocean. Why do we need to go? Why do I want to go? Because we are more and more appreciating the value of the oceans to our survival and well-being. It should be perfectly obvious, but it has taken the present time to really communicate this understanding to the general population, because we are by nature terrestrial. It's easy to think of land as being where the action is instead of the oceans, but that view from space and just kind of waking up with a fresh pair of eyes and realizing that the character of the planet is shaped by the oceans, by the water that is here. It's true on land as well, but it is certainly true taking the whole planet into consideration, that weather, climate, the cycles of water that are essential for our survival and well-being, and for the survival and well-being of life on Earth generally, whether it's terrestrial or aquatic. These patterns of weather and climate that we take for granted, that are shaped by what happens to the ocean. We've begun to understand the importance of finding out what drives this system. What role do the polar ice caps play in terms of shaping ocean currents And how does this affect the weather? How does it affect the climate of the planet as a whole?
So some of these secrets are a little subtle, and in many ways maybe you'd say it's a reordering of priority and understanding of how it all fits together. It's really a part of your experience as you're going about your work under the sea.
Well, I started in looking at the ocean with just plain human curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
Little kids have it. I was a little kid when I started fooling around in the oceans. And many youngsters, I think, get discouraged with this curiosity and are told very early on, don't touch this, don't step on, or don't, something's going to bite you or it's going to sting, don't, just don't. My parents and many of the fine teachers I've had, fortunately, have had a different attitude. They've managed to preserve and encourage that curiosity. Scientists, I think, are really lucky because it is inherent in scientists to be curious. It's the nature of the beast. And maybe it's the nature of humans generally, but with scientists it's particularly well developed. We have, in recent times, begun to see how not just individual components or individual focal points are in their own right, but how they fit together. I was impressed, even as a child, that everything affects everything else one way or the other. That some express it very poetically, that there's this fabric of nature and you tug on one end and it causes ripples throughout the entire network of life. I had a professor as a student, as we were stomping across a sand dune, point out that every footprint that we were leaving behind was making a difference. That you were, in a sense, tugging at the fabric of the universe because every little depression modified the shape of that dune. That was a place where seeds could gather, a plant could grow, catch the wind, catch the sand, cause the dune to shape this way instead of that way, stabilize it. And all of us said, well, we're just walking across the dune. I mean, we're changing the way the whole world might turn, and it is a little far-fetched to think that you're making a big difference, but in fact, the world turns based on little differences, a lot of subtleties that stack up to make something happen one way or the other. It happens to all of us every day in our everyday lives, but for one tiny little thing, it all would have been different. Mm-hmm. And either you just missed the airplane, but for that one small delay that set in motion a whole series of other things. But for putting your footprint in the sand, things would have been different. Very different in some cases. It's that fascination with how systems work and what you can do, or how you can refrain from not doing certain things, how you can make a difference, that certainly fascinates me. It fascinates ecologists generally. It fascinates economists. That is, again, how does a system work? How can you nudge the system to make it go this way or go that way? Ecologists and economists have a great deal in common in that respect. They sometimes use different terminology, but the principles are the same.
Let's talk about that, because I think you talked about the little delicate differences that each person can make just with a footstep on the sand. But then we're looking at a world in which human beings are making tremendous differences with the aid of technology that perhaps you see as a tool to get into your work, but also can be used as a tool perhaps for distraction. So how is it that we can make the right kinds of differences, and how can ordinary people get involved to help make differences that protect the planet in a good kind of way as opposed to destructive?
Some people, looking at all of geologic time, recognizing the tremendous differences that have taken place in the last century, refer to this as the bulldozer heroic, because without that one piece of equipment, things would be very different. Well, maybe we'd find some other clever technique to destroy forests and clear land, but when you reflect upon the impact of our technology, not just bulldozers, but across the board with the chainsaws, the technique that we have to, in a few years, in a few decades, make differences to the not just the landscape, not just the configuration, but the way systems interact and work, that this is a time of magnified significance. We impose on the planet changes of geologic consequence, things that normally would have taken 100 or 200 or 1,000 years or 1,000,000 years to accomplish. We, with a snap of our fingers, in a split second of time, we fill a bay. We destroy a forest that has been tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years in the making. We join oceans with canals. We change the course of rivers. Now, some of these processes do occur naturally, but we are doing them all at once, all over the planet. And the system is necessarily adjusting or not adjusting. It's changing. It's changing in a way that may cause the planetary systems to no longer be hospitable for us. And I think from our selfish human standpoint, this is a cause for real concern and a cause for some scurrying around to try to figure out what is happening. We're concerned at this point in time, in 1990, about the possible impact of so-called greenhouse gases, of an overabundance of CO2 in the atmosphere, an increase in a very short period of time through the burning of fossil fuel, and the release of gases, methane and so on, into the atmosphere. Is this going to cause a global warming? Will sea level rise? Well, we really don't know. We do know that there has been a time in the past when the climate has been warmer. We know there have been times previously when CO2 was more abundant in the atmosphere than it is now. And some say, well, the Earth got by all right. We're here. Somehow life survived. And the response to that is, of course, life is very resilient. But whether the conditions on the planet will be suitable for us, whether we can survive the changes that we are inducing, because the system hasn't got the capability to shift in such a way that it will shift back to the way we like it, the way we have adjusted over the centuries. I mean, we're newcomers on the planet. After all, the earliest human-like creatures are thought to have occurred maybe on the order of 5 billion years ago. Primates, 60 to 65 million years ago. But in a planet that goes back 4.6 billion years with life, what is it, 2.5 billion years, our existence is just the last few seconds in this whole span of history. Sure, life will get by with or without us. If there's more CO2 or less CO2, life will go on. But whether we can still maintain the quality of life that we want, that we have come to admire and wish to perpetuate. We want to have things better, not worse than they presently are. Mm-hmm. And yet we are changing things so that we're like sitting in the middle of a big experiment, not something remote and detached. Well, let's fiddle with this and jiggle with that, mm-hmm, and see how it comes out. We're sitting right there in the test tube ourselves and pouring things in and jiggling the circumstances and saying, well, I wonder it's going to be all right. Or actually, we aren't wondering very much. Historically, we haven't. And when you weigh humankind as a whole and look at who's thinking about what, most of the 5 billion people on the planet now aren't worrying about such things. It's up to those who are exposed to maybe the broad circumstances, who have a responsibility to, on behalf of mankind as a whole, think about the ways and means of solving the real problems that face us right now. And one of the real problems that is at the heart of the changes has to do with the way that we have prospered as a species in a short period of time, and how our population has grown to such an extent that we have used up the accumulated wealth of the millennia that preceded us in a very short piece of time. Not that we could not have sustained some of the wealth had we been wise and aware of it. We could sustain the rainforests in Brazil now in such a way that we could have that as a resource forever, but we aren't being very smart about the real value of that forest. We're cutting it down, burning it, turning it into a place to graze cattle. Short-term gain, long-term loss. The same is true in our own U.S. northwestern forests. For short-term gain, for the timber resource alone, we are destroying an incredibly productive system that on its own releases into the atmosphere oxygen that we don't know how to build a system that is more efficient, more effective in maintaining our life support system than those old forests that have been doing this and have matured in such an extent with all the mosses, all the ferns, all the interacting, perpetuating systems that can withstand changes and with a buffering action that many species deliver, that a diverse system can produce, that monocultures, a tree farm that really is focused just on trees, cannot do. Has no way. The surface area alone on a place that is just designed to produce trees without the mosses, the ferns, and all of the little critters that contribute to the action in the most efficient way that nature knows how, developed through all of time to create this system that we take for granted. It's not very smart use of our resources. But that is one of the big problems. Too many people drawing on too little a loaf. So if we learn how to keep the numbers within a certain balance, given the resources that we know are finite, that will certainly go a long way toward alleviating one of the other major problems, and that's poverty. That is, again, at the root of one of the major sources of trouble for humankind. And it relates to the destruction of natural resources. A hungry person, a cold person, isn't going to think so much about the day after tomorrow. You're going to think about, how am I going to survive right now? You're not going to worry about seeds for next year's crop if those seeds represent the only meal for your family today and tomorrow. And poverty and too many people on too small a planet represent an interlocking problem that in turn relate to the third big area, and that's the loss, the diminishing of the natural resources and the loss of species, the loss of systems. We're losing species right now at the rate of about 4 species per minute. Most of those species are insects that are being lost either through the destruction of rainforests, where speciation has taken place at such a phenomenal rate, and another loss is in terms of the changing chemistry of the planet above water as well as below, where we have applied pesticides, something that Rachel Carson said in Alarm many years ago. Watch out what you're doing. You're really destroying the source of your good health, which in turn is really wealth. If you're able to have time on the planet, quality time, what is more important than that? Wouldn't you, no matter how wealthy you are, put as much of your resources you possibly could to buy health, to buy time? No amount of money can really buy that. But money can buy the source of it. We can buy wilderness. We can restore damaged systems. We can put our arms around healthy ocean, healthy forests, healthy dunes, healthy marshes, healthy wetlands, because that is the source of our global health and well-being.
I can sense an urgency from you about the need to protect the planet, and at the same time I recognize you're right that the bulk of the people are worried about their own individual survival, making the living, and perhaps are not as attuned to the issues, and so it boils down to a handful of prominent persons who are actively working on it to really make some changes. But I also hear from friends, family, neighbors, the same sorts of concerns that you're articulating, but without as much of a feeling of control over it as perhaps you might feel that you could have by giving the message and talking. Why don't we just close this segment with just maybe a few thoughts from you about what people can do, ordinary people who are not on the front lines of some movement.
Through communication, no person who tunes into the radio or television or magazines, and that is not everybody on the planet, but those who are aware and wonder oh, the problems are so enormous. What can I, as one person, do? Because it just seems so futile. Well, how can I make a difference? And yet, like the footprints on the beach, everybody does make a difference. Everybody has the potential for making a magnified impact. My mother has been a tree planter all her life, and so has my father. In their individual lifetimes, they have put back to the planet probably, maybe, more than they have taken out in terms of the trees that it takes to keep us supplied with newspapers and so on. Certainly they've made a concerted effort to do as much as two people can do. My mother is now 87, but in the past year she's been personally responsible out there with young trees, putting the mulch, holding the hose, and getting started young oak trees, native trees in Florida that will hang on and persist, that won't require tender loving mollycoddling, as they say, as they grow older, because they're adapted to that area. Planting native trees in the area where you are is a big first step. Planting native plants of any sort. While I love a nice green lawn, and there's some lovely green lawns in North America, a nice thing to do is to give some of it back to nature. Plant a tree where grass is. I mean, grasses and the native wild grasses, if you could plant those back, it would be wonderful. But we spend so much time and energy mowing the lawn and keeping a lawn healthy. If you could somehow think, well, what would it be like if I had wildflowers there? Or let's try planting some shrubs that are self-tending. That's a nice way to get out of cutting the grass. Or you can have a little patch where you want to have a cluster of places to sit down and so on. But watch what happens when you do such a thing. Birds will come. Some really interesting insects like praying mantises will begin, and butterflies. You can actually plant flowers and bushes that will attract hummingbirds and butterflies and things that won't come to a lawn because it's boring. It's just old grass. Well, grass is beautiful. If I could plant a lawn that is just native grasses that nobody makes me mow, that would be another form of working with nature to do something that is healthy and contributes, that gives back. Grass flowers, if you stop and look at them, are wonderful. But we usually don't give grass a chance to make flowers. We keep lopping it off to a little stubby height, which has its place, but it's not every place. That's one thing that you can do. But if you also think about, in the course of even a single day, but extrapolated over a week or a month or a year, about how much garbage you create. What do you do with the cans, the bottles, the bags, the plastics that are generated? We just sort of toss them over our shoulder, get them out of my sight. We're really good about this. We bag them up and put them carefully into some place where they're taken away. But astronauts know that there is no away. This is one little tiny planet. We relocate things. We don't put them away. We don't make them disappear. Even things that are burned go into the atmosphere. It's this thin shell that surrounds us. We have put things, relocated it into the sky, but it's still ours. An oil spill, when it evaporates, people say, the oil is gone. Well, it isn't gone. It's evaporated into the other part of our environment, the atmosphere. We just have put the molecules that have constituted this medium up into the sky instead of down there on the ground. If you think about what you do as you go about life, farmers know for sure, especially farmers who've had their closeness to the soil go back for 30, 40, 50 years, when there wasn't a convenient garbage service to come by and pick up the trash. You had to figure out what to do with it yourself. Everything didn't come over-packaged. One of the greatest anomalies or mysteries to me is why some grocery stores package bananas. You find them in a little styrofoam slid wrapped around with a cellophane wrapper. Bananas that come already pre-packaged in one of the neatest natural wrappings that you can imagine. Beyond that, we take them and put it into a bag that gets transported away. So we have the bag, the cellophane, and the wrapper, and then you have the banana peel as well. Even coconuts. I've found coconuts wrapped in cellophane in grocery stores, things that are, well, we just really overpackage. And we have gotten very complacent about this thing. And the throwaway mentality of there's a virtue in having something you use only once. Even cameras now, throwaway cameras, throwaway pens, throwaway. But it isn't a way. If we could begin to value those resources, and we are, as an individual, try to make those choices that will enable you to live most harmoniously within your environmental means. If one person does it, that's a help. 2 people do it, it's a bigger help. 10 people, 20, you get the word around. It really does make a difference.
Thank you. I think that was a wonderful way to end.